All right. It is March 28th, 2025. We are in Paris at the École des hautes études en sciences sociales. I'm delighted to be here with Matteo Polleri. Matteo has done the most important recent work on the relationship between Foucault and Marx. And so I thought that it would be really important for us to explore that, to go into more depth, and to really try and understand how to think about reading Marx through Foucault and how to think about reading Foucault through Marx. Matteo wrote his dissertation on the relationship between Marx and Foucault, and he was doing it both at the École Normale in Pisa and at the University of Paris in Nanterre, working with Roberto Esposito in Pisa and with Judith Revel here in Paris. That work is forthcoming in a book that'll be in English, as well as other articles that Matteo has been writing. Welcome, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Bernard.
Okay, so what I'm hoping that we can do, more than anything, is kind of set aside the kind of simplistic reductionist ways of reading both Marx and Foucault, and especially of reading Marx through Foucault or Foucault through Marx, to get rid of the straw men interpretations and to really to focus as much as possible substantively on what we can get from a reading of the texts and how they enrich each other. And so I thought that maybe the place to start, I think, at least the place where I would start, because it's here that I think that there is it's the greatest moment of a rapprochement, of a bringing together of the way in which they engaged the world, is to think about or to compare the way that Marx was writing about the 1848 revolution. So to look at his work on class conflicts in France, the 18th of Brumaire, where he's writing about the 1848 revolution in France and in Germany on the one hand, and to compare it to the way that Foucault is writing about class conflict. He's writing about it in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, before he publishes Surveiller et Punir, a period where I really feel as if there's the greatest kind of proximity in their approach. So let's start there and focus on these texts in a way. The 18th Brumaire on the one hand, maybe Penal Theories and Institutions, or Société Punitive, or Discipline and Punish, or the work that he was doing with the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons and his exchanges with Maoists, etc. At that time. If we start there, kind of, what are the ways do you think that each one can enrich the other?
I think that a way to go beyond the simplification and dogmas, let's call it this way, that are usually mobilized to talk about the Marx-Foucault relationship, is to begin from their family resemblances. Let's say you just mentioned the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, the information group on prisons, that Foucault was, in which Foucault was deeply involved to strike both for political prisoners from the Maoist French left and to produce uprisings within the prison system in France. And it is interesting to start from this point, because we can see something that is in a way preconceptual concerning the relationship between Marx and Foucault. That is to say that Foucault, as much as Marx, thinks his own gest of social criticism starting from militant inquiry, at least in this period.
Right. Militant inquiry, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or militant investigations,
right.
enquêtes militantes, or
right.
enquêtes
right.
ouvrières.
Right.
This is, of course, the case of Marx in his own work, namely in the historical so-called texts you were mentioning. Marx's way of addressing the social struggles in France is not external from them, but rather internal. In the same way, Foucault thinks his genealogy of prisons starting from his own experience within the struggles for political prisoners and normal prisoners in the conjuncture of the early 70s in France. This is a first, I think, interesting way to posit the question, which is not a frontal position between two general conceptual frameworks, but rather begins from underlying a common way of conceiving.
Right. So is that kind of like a methodological similarity, a methodological
that's
proximity?
First, I would even say epistemological similarity. They have a shared, like to use a specific expression, materialist epistemology. They do think that knowledge on social reality and social mechanisms of oppression and domination come from social struggles.
Right.
And
right.
I know you organized a great seminar on praxis and critique, and we have here a shared way of conceiving this articulation through militant investigation.
Right. So that's very interesting, and it's very interesting that you place Foucault within a materialist epistemological framework, which I think is entirely right, but it's not often done. I don't think. I mean, I don't think that is the more common reading of Foucault. But I think it's entirely right, and I think it traces back to much earlier, and questions of his relationship to experience in the 1950s, actually, in his work, in the early work with Binswanger as well. So, what could you say about Foucault's materialism, in a way?
To put it in a nutshell, I would say that there are three main affinities we can see if we compare Marx and Foucault, starting from this first consideration of this materialist shared epistemology they have. The first one is that they conceived social criticism as an externalization of the very traditional objects of philosophy. They do not start from a classic object of theoretical reflection, but rather turn philosophy outbound in a way. They look for, as you said, specific social experiences of domination. In the case of Marx, of course, it is about economic dynamics, firstly. But it would be interesting, this conversation, to go deeply into this idea of an economicism in Marx. This is one of the things at stake when reading Marx and Foucault together, to find, internal heresies expanding this notion of economy in Marx's thought. In the case of Foucault, of course, it's about other social experiences of power and domination. But this is a first, I guess, affinities. Conception of social criticism, which is based on an externalization of the traditional object of philosophy. This is the first thing. A second thing, but then I would love to know what you feel about it, is the idea that social criticism does not start from a normative understanding of its own activity, which is very different from how today certain strands of critical theory, such as the Frankfurt-inspired contemporary critical theory, it's a very different way of thinking social criticism, while contemporary reflections on critical theory are often based on firstly defining the normative standards from which critique should be done. In Marx and Foucault, we can find a similar way of having a practical, pragmatic, I would even say, conception of norm. They do not have an interest into discussing the standards, the moral standards of critique, but they do have a shared political and epistemological praxis of critique. They rather try to explain in order to transform or even abolish certain specific mechanisms of domination instead of self-reflecting on the very jest of criticizing them. This is a second consequence, I guess, of this common passion for militant investigations that Marx and Foucault have. There is maybe a third, family resemblances, which is about the political horizon of this focus on experience. We could say, using Foucault's vocabulary, but we can expand this vocabulary onto Marx, we could say that the main idea of these militant investigations they were doing was to turn social experience of domination into possibility of break through political subjectivation. This is what is at stake in both Marx's historical writings on the social and class struggles in France and in his workers' inquiry, which has inspired a long-standing history of Marxist militant investigations, from the Johnson Forest tendency in the US to the Italian operaismo, passing through the experience of socialismo barbarie in France. This is, I think, a framework we could use to think together Marx and Foucault, stepping back from an immediate frontal confrontation between their main concepts.
Right. Okay, great. Let's take those one at a time, I think. And first, on the question of the objects, right? The objects of critique, the objects of study. I mean, one place where there is a difference is the way in which kind of Marx is always focused on the present differently than Foucault is focused on the present. I mean, Marx is writing about the struggles that are going on right at the moment at which he's writing, right? I mean, it's the 48 in France, 49 in Germany, 1871 with the Commune. Foucault, on the other hand, always displaces, even though perhaps, I mean, the early 70s is the moment when he's the most focused on a present, but even then he displaces it, for instance, to 1639 and the rebellion in Normandy. How do we think about that? Because there seems to be a difference in sensitivities there, in a way of kind of confronting the present in its presence versus confronting the present by means of another historical inquiry, or a historical inquiry, or something like that. How should we think about that?
A first remark I would share is the fact that we have two specular ways of outbounding, of externalizing the very activity of social criticism. While Foucault goes through history as a main discipline to overturn philosophy, Marx used economics. So this is why we have maybe, different ways of understanding the present of struggles. But there is a second remark you make me think of that, is that Foucault himself, in this very famous text on the subject and power, in which he tries to resume at one point his whole trajectory, argues that there are three main models to understand social conflict. And he presents these models both in a synchronic and diachronic way. According to him, we would have, in a chronological order, struggles against political domination in the early modernity. Let's think of, for instance, the French Revolution at the end of this process, struggling again to abolish sovereignty and monarchy. Then we would have, in his view, a long phase of struggles against economic exploitation, and we can think of the long-standing history of the socialist and communist movement, to which Marx thought belonged. for sure. But eventually, and Foucault comes to his own present by saying that we would have struggles against forms of subjugation, assujettissement in French. This is the type of struggle, the model of social conflict that Foucault is trying to conceptualize and in a way extend by his own genealogy. So it is interesting to notice today how untimely it was in 1983 to modelize the different types of social struggle like that. Mm-hmm. Why? Because Foucault, and through this reflection, we can go back to the relevance of addressing Marx and Foucault together today. When we think of Marx-Foucault relationship today, we see in a way this kind of opposition between the struggles for liberating the subjectivity, which is Foucault's model of struggle. He's clearly saying in this text that his whole work was about promoting, supporting the struggles against subjugation, assujettissement. And on the other side, we would have today Marx is saying that Foucault was precisely abandoning the other models of social struggle. So in a way, this text allows us to see that when we talk about Marx and Foucault, we're not just talking about historical figures of critical thought, but we are addressing a vital debate which is ongoing today between, in a way, intersectional grids of analysis based on concepts such as powers, social oppression, and the matrix of dominations, which is related to Foucault's work. And on the other hand, a more traditional Marxist way of conceiving social struggles based on exploitation.
Right, yeah,
workers.
Yeah. I wonder, I mean, you drew it as a contrast between a historical-based analysis and an economic-based analysis at the beginning. But I think that by the end of what you were suggesting, it's not so much a contrast between history and economics as it is a contrast between layers of, or concentric circles of forms of domination and subjectification, in a way. And there's almost a time at which it feels, in the 1970s, Foucault is at the heart of those concentric circles, where Marx is, in a way, in the kind of direct class conflicts. And it's not surprising that Foucault uses his most Marxist sounding language at that time, right? So could it be that if we stayed at that core, right? What are the differences in the conception of power that Foucault develops versus Marx? We always think that Foucault kind of developed a unique conception of power, of relations of power. I think in a way he was straw-manning Marx himself when he was doing that, to suggest that, it's not like the bourgeoisie has power over the proletariat. It would be much too simple to think about that way for Marx. What are the differences that remain in some way? And which one can enrich the other, Foucault or Marx, on the question of power, once we're in the heart of the concentric circles, in a space of clear class conflict?
I think that you are referring to a very specific conjuncture in Foucault's trajectory in the early 70s. At that time, Foucault is engaged in a kind of a confrontation, which is also a competition with Marx and Marxism. His taking the very conundrum, the historical problems of Marxism, social reproduction, state apparatuses, workforce, labor force, which is a key point in my understanding of his dialogue with Marxism, class struggle, and he's trying to do something better compared to what Marxists did it around these questions. I think what could be interesting to understand the differences you were mentioning in their ways of conceiving power is to stress the ways in which Foucault tried to first historicize the conception of labor force in these texts. The very concept of discipline he's developing before the publication of Discipline and Punish is a way to think the political operations that are presupposed to the exploitation of the workforce, how labor force is produced politically by a certain way of managing time and connected people to means of production. This is a first
and that's certainly
path.
You get that in Discipline and Punish, right? I mean, that's the part where actually he's referring to capital,
This
specifically
famous
saying
accumulation of man, which is previous to the accumulation of capital.
right.
But there is a second path, which is maybe even more interesting, which is seeing how, by doing that, by explaining how powers play a key role in producing the workforce, he's also expanding the very concept of class struggle. He is expanding this concept in two main ways. To me, the first concern the scene of class struggle. The scene of class struggle to Foucault at that time is not only the public scene, factories, streets, cities, barricades, strikes, but class struggle is situated within the very production of subjectivity. The wage workers is living class struggle in his own subjectivity. This is connected to an idea in Italian operaismo, the idea that the workers struggle to abolish himself as a worker. This is Tronti's idea. And the second path of expansion of class struggle is the practices and subjects of this struggle. In Foucault's view at the time, it is implicit in his text, but we can now notice that more clearly. The subject and practices of class struggle are not reducible to what traditional Marxism used to think class struggle was. These practices are not only about antagonism with the capitalists, it's also about differentiation from the social norms which produce the workforce as an homogeneous quantity of time that can be put at work in the factory. They are about exode, in a way, trying to go out of the circuits of the capitalist accumulation.
Right.
They, in a way, it's about thinking not simply the abolition of the mode of production as a frontal opposition, but as a deviation. That's, I think, an interesting path to follow.
Yeah. I mean, what this makes me think is that if we think of kind of concentric circles of forms of domination and subjugation, and we place at the heart of it the kind of the real the worker class struggle that Marx had identified, and that Foucault is prepared to focus on at a particular period, then what we could think of is that kind of Foucault allows us to move to those other concentric spaces to try and apply the same kind of understanding of power and of social conflict. What happens, I think, in that process is that you lose the economic core dimension as you kind of go to the other concentric circles, or you don't lose them, but you lose sight of them in a way. And so it then becomes possible to have a reading of Foucault, for instance, as looking at broader forms of subjugation in terms of sexuality, in terms of madness, that aren't as directly tied to the economic struggle. And but maybe the problem is simply that's a loosening of the connection to the economic struggle that just we have to be attentive to. In other words, it's not a problem, or it's not inherent to Foucault's broader enlargement of the method that you would detach it from economic struggle, right?
I definitely agree with your point, but I would frame it differently. Maybe.
Okay.
I would say that rather than abandon the very concept of economy or the economic sphere as the center of gravity of social domination, Foucault, at least at that very specific moment of his work, the early 70s, the first half of the 70s, is inviting us to expand and complexify this concept of the economic sphere,
Okay.
of what Marxists call the infrastructure
Okay.
of capitalism. And he's inviting us to complexify our notion of the economic sphere by putting relations of power and social norms at the very core of this economic sphere. There is a famous passage at the end of one of the lectures he was giving before the publication of Discipline and Punish, where he explicitly argues that his work at that period was a way to think relations of power as a constitutive part of the mode of production, rather than an external, superficial effect. This is, I think, a very interesting way to think today economy and the mode of production. And what is paradoxical is that it resonates with an idea that is as old as Horkheimer. The early Horkheimer was inviting us to think economy in a broad sense and not in a strict, narrow, traditional Marxist sense. So we can find, of course, Foucault and the Frankfurt School are very far from each other. It is an entire different topic. But this way of expanding, complexifying the infrastructure, the economic infrastructure, we find a resonance between other strands of heretical Marxism. I would like to know what you think about another point, which is how we use this invitation that Foucault made in the early 70s to read famous Marx text, which is the, let's say, the specular operation. And I think that once we go back, for instance, to Capital Volume 1, having in mind this Foucault's insight, which is thinking the relations of power at the core as constitutive functions of the mode of production rather than external reflex, we find quite a complex conceptualization of power in Marx himself. Let's take 3 different chapters. In the first section of Capital Volume 1, we have the idea of capital as a mute compulsion to consumption and work. And this is, in a way, at the flat surface of capital. Then if we go to the end, to the famous chapter on the so-called primitive, we should say original accumulation, we have a completely different idea. The idea that violence is the productive factor at least at the beginning of capitalism, but this productive violence is making capital goes back to it at every time, at each moment of the process. It's not something situated in the past, but it's something that comes back to the present.
Right.
This is a genealogical moment
Right.
in Marx's inquiry in Capital.
Right.
And then third moment, if we go to the very center of Capital Volume 1, the fourth section on cooperation and the big industry, we find this specific concept, which is the commando in German, through which Marx is kind of describing what Foucault would have called microphysics of relations of power within the factory.
Right.
The specific technologies through which, in the capitalist process of work, workers are put as productive subjects. So in a way, there is this peculiarity, we can stress Foucault's ideas and powers from Marxian and Marxist questions, as we were doing, and at the same time go back to Marx's text to find something different, or in a way some heresies within his own text. I think this double movement is what it's interesting today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my reading of Capital is one that is very inflected by the young Marx and all the way through the Grundrisse, right? I tend to read Capital as being far more centrally engaged in questions of subjectivation and the ways in which we lose our appreciation of the social relations that are at the basis of commodities and production, right? So I mean, I think this is a particular reading of Marx, which tries not to create an epistemological break between the early and the late Marx. And actually here, I mean, and what's interesting here, I should tell them to make less noise outside, but I think we're okay, is actually the third period would be the late Marx, actually, with a turn to other relations of power in the Russian agricultural context, etc. And I think you could read that back also somewhat into Capital. But so I think you're entirely right, and I agree with the reading that we can see more work of Marx that is, in a way, the family resemblances with Foucault, that we can see them in Capital when we start reading Capital as being much more the product of decades-long philosophical investigations. And when you trace the violence of what we call, primitive accumulation back to the violence that he was seeing in the context of the early articles in 1842 on, thefts of wood and whatnot. So what that does, in a way, is it helps us to reread Marx's more strictly economic work through a philosophical lens, and through the philosophical lens specifically of subjectivation and forms of subjugation, which usually take the expression of something like alienation, obviously, which was clearly on the surface in 1844, and comes out again, and you can hear it. You can hear it in the Grundrisse, you can hear it in Capital as well. But yes, so now the question there becomes, so we're obviously focusing on the places where there is a rich back and forth, an enrichment of each. and putting aside some of the work for each one that might be less directly in conversation. I think we could probably do the work with Confessions of the Flesh as well, but it's less easy, or it's to me it's less interesting to do that work. To me, what I find most productive is to figure out how they're enriching each other during those formative periods when they're both really focused on questions of social struggle, right? So I think we've covered at least two of the topics that you had raised at the beginning, which is questions of the objects of historical inquiry as related to questions of power, and then questions of political subjectivation. In the middle, you had mentioned something about immanent critique, and in part, I think you were. In part, the question of immanent critique in the Frankfurt School is somewhat complicated because the different generations of the Frankfurt School and their relationship to it. But you were trying to suggest that there's both in Foucault and Marx, there's a similar relationship or distancing from forms of immanent critique. Do you want to develop that for a second and try and...
Yeah, I would love to use a joke and a metaphor. I start from the metaphor. To resume what we have been saying over the last minutes, we could say that starting from these very moments in which Foucault is struggling with struggles, we could say that Foucault has a psychological relationship to Marx that we can describe as Marx as a big adder, to use the Lacanian language. And a big adder is a very specific notion. The big adder is both the symbolic, the simulacrum, that one has to challenge to define his own identity, in Foucault's case, political and theoretical identity, and the order which cannot be completely destroyed. Within, we find our own identity. And Marx plays this dual role at this very moment.
And Foucault was always aware of that.
Of course.
He always recognized that, Marx is incontournable. You can't do history without relating yourself somehow to Marx.
Without encountering and clash with Marx. That's the dual sense of the Marx as a big adder for Foucault. I come to the joke. We could say that by contrast to other strands of contemporary critical theory, Marx and Foucault are both specific intellectuals. And that could sound heretical to the Gramscian scholars, the Gramscian Marxist scholars. We used to develop this idea of the organic intellectual. But in a way, Marx and Foucault are both developing immanent critiques of social reality because they are specifically active, they are engaged, involved within specific struggles. And that's a very interesting way to address both Foucault's idea of the specific intellectual and to discover a different image of Marx's work, which is historically connected to the history of the official communist parties in the East, in the West, historically communist parties which existed after Marx's death. We should always remember that when Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, there was no party for that manifesto. And in a way, he was a militant from a party to come, from a specter. So, and I think that this idea of Marx and Foucault as specific intellectuals shouldn't sound as an anti-Marxist way of thinking Marx, but can shed light on the specific type of engagement and therefore the specific type of immanent critique Marx was developing at this time.
When we think of the term specific intellectual, which we always associate with Foucault. I mean, I think what you're suggesting is right, is that Marx qualifies under our general understanding of what a specific intellectual would be, which is an intellectual who is kind of focused on their particular topic, their particular struggle, and not willing to simply, make statements about anything, right? And there's no doubt that Marx, more than anyone, was specifically focusing on particular social struggles, right?
And he was developing, as Foucault was doing in the early 70s through the Groupe d'information sur les prisons, a circular relationship between praxis and critique.
Right.
There is no overdetermination of praxis by critique, by theory, nor the other way around. There is no overdetermination of theory by praxis. But this circular, those are Deleuze's words in a famous conversation with Foucault on the Groupe d'information sur les prisons. This circular way of practicing social theory, which is a very Marxian rather than Marxist way of thinking this relationship. So the specific intellectual is the one who is not saying universal things, universal ideas based on theory, based on the main laws of history.
Mm-hmm.
But it is someone who is inducing critical concepts
Right.
from militant investigations.
Right. Let me ask them if they can make less noise. Maybe that will help. All right, okay. Now, but in terms of immanence here, so I take it, I mean, when we use the term immanent critique, what we're trying to suggest is that there are internal conflicts within the present system of values that we can use as a way to get beyond the problems of the present in a way. And we can contrast that to, external forms of critique where you're taking on from outside a particular value system and saying you're critiquing it from the outside, saying it's the wrong set of values. And you're also contrasting that to an purely internal critique where you're saying that there are inconsistencies or that the logic doesn't work, right? You're really trying to find contradictions inside a set of values that could be productive in a Hegelian way, really.
Contradictions which are at the same time promises of a different world.
Right. Now, in what way would you say that Foucault is doing immanent critique then?
I would borrow Daniele Lorenzini's expression. According to Lorenzini, Foucault is developing through genealogy possibilizing critique. The very goal of genealogy in Foucault is not simply to reconstruct the past and through the past building a prism to understand the present. This is a very simplistic idea of the ontology of the present that Foucault was developing in the 70s and the 80s. But this genealogy is trying to break up, open up moments of possibilities or heterotopias, to use a Foucauldian expression, within the present. That is, I think, the closest sense of Foucault's works to immanent critique, which is very far from Foucault's vocabulary and philosophical problems.
Yeah, heterotopias are a little bit tricky because heterotopias include asylums and prisons. So it's always a tricky place to go, I find, in Foucault's work. Could it be that the immanence is a different kind of immanence than what we usually talk about in terms of immanent critique with a Hegelian or Frankfurt School notion in mind? which is, I don't know, dealing with the reality of the present, in a way. I mean, maybe it's a slightly more sociological conception of immanence than philosophical conception of immanence. In which case, of course, the 70s for Foucault, but 78 as well, when he's trying to deal with or address the Iranian Revolution, right? Or the whole project of the Corriere della Sera investigations that they were going to be doing there. It really is kind of like, Foucault referred to it sometimes as the modern attitude, or, in Kant, this idea of the attitude of modernity, or trying to make histories of the present, all of those different ways in which he was trying to say it. But it's the place where it seems to me Foucault and Marx come closest together are when Foucault is directly trying to address conflicts in the present. And that, I take it, is when you suggest, or you're suggesting, that there's a notion of immanence. Is that it?
There's a long and for a long time hidden interview that Foucault gave to the French Trotskyist journal Rouge. The interviewer was Christian Laval. At the time, he was a militant of the Ligue communiste révolutionnaire, the main French Trotskyist revolutionary organization of the 70s and the 80s. And that interview, and the Italian title for this conversation was The Immanence of Power. Foucault talks a lot in a quite a provocative and ironical way of his relationship with Marx and Marxism. He's basically provoking reactions in here his Trotskyist interviewers. And at one point he says that his work is not a way to put aside class struggle, but is a way to think, and I quote, les drames quotidiens, the daily dramas of class struggle and class conflict. And in a way, he's trying to disseminating the immanence of the social, and I do share your sociological view of immanence in that sense. He's trying to disseminate the class struggle in the immanence of the multiple social relations that compose our social world. From the family to sexuality, from the relation we have with doctor or the psychiatric ward, from prisons to the factory, from school to the hospital.
Right. That's exactly the idea of the concentric circles in a way, right? Exactly. It's coming back to the idea of the concentric circles, that somehow what Foucault allows us to do in a way is to think about the other forms of domination, subjugation, subjectification that happen in the outer spaces of the most direct social conflict. And it's interesting because when you read Foucault in 72, 73, you really have a sense that he understands what's going on at the core, or he views it in a very similar way as being, the heart of or at the heart of the conflict, or what's driving the conflicts. In other words, these concentric circles of going out to family, sexuality, gender, and it's interesting. I mean, actually, you have to put race at the heart, I think, of the concentric circles. You can't put it outside.
I was about to ask, what is at the center of these concentric circles in your view?
Yeah. Well, here I think is the place where Marx and Foucault, well, maybe the Marx of Cedric Robinson and the Black radical tradition, a very specific Marx, right, converge with race wars being at the heart of the social conflict, right? And these are and Foucault did that in Il faut défendre la société. You know, society must be defended. He too located race war at the heart of, as actually a progenitor of class warfare.
It is another strategic moment in Foucault's relationship with Marx. Il faut défendre la société, society must be defended. Because here, in a long footnote, Foucault is going as far as changing the very text of Marx's letters to Engels.
Right.
He's changing the very text to argue, he adds
race
something.
War, right.
Exactly.
He adds
to
race
argue
war,
that
right.
Marx himself derived his conception of class struggle from the race wars.
Right.
This is a very, very curious, very original moment in Foucault, and very emblematic. It's a paradigmatic example of how Foucault was struggling and confronting Marx by changing his own text, by misquoting on purpose Marx.
On purpose or by mistake or subconsciously or Freudian
whether
slip
conscious or not,
right.
It is paradigmatic.
Yeah.
And we go back to the Marx as a big adder, which is always operating.
Right.
In Foucault's mind.
Right. Yeah.
But you were saying something really interesting to me, which is because it is one of the main challenges for scholars who want to produce in non-linear convergence between Marx's critique of political economy and Foucault microphysics or analytics of powers, which is the relationship between Marx's concept of workers' alienation, which is of course connected to an idea of emancipation or de-alienation, and Foucault's notion of subjectivation, which is connected to the dynamic which produces subjugation, assujettissement. Because here we find maybe what Etienne Balibar would call the main antinomy, on the main point of adversity between Marx and Foucault. If we have a naive reading of Marx's concept of alienation, we could easily ending up by saying that while Foucault has a conception of liberation or emancipation which is based on the idea of an infinite differentiation from the social norms, an infinite process of subjectification, Marx stays within an Hegelian paradigm of alienation and disalienation, dialectical vision of emancipation. And this is, to me, maybe the most difficult philosophical challenge for scholars as me who try to read together in the perspective of a cooperation, of an articulation, Marx and Foucault's critical frameworks.
Yeah. But that, again, is a kind of highlighting or spotlighting a particular piece of the text. And the piece of the text is the paradoxical utopianism of Marx, in a way. Paradoxical because, of course, he was opposed to utopianism and utopias and whatnot. And yet, I think, as Etienne Balibar correctly suggests, he was a utopian, right? The main, yeah. I mean,
the best.
Yes, right. But, and that element, that utopian element, you do not find, I think you do not find in Foucault. And the idea, and any reading of Marx that would allow us to think of some transition to a space without conflict or without the state, or, is something that you do not find in Foucault, right? So the question becomes, how important is it to retain that piece of Marx or those texts? is it essential to understanding the way in which he applies a microphysics of power to social conflict and class conflict in France in 1848, 1849? I'm not sure. I mean, in part, I keep on bringing us back to these historical journalistic writings of his. But, you know, I mean, he was a journalist. Marx was a journalist.
Maybe another family resemblance is their specific philosophical and political journalism, which is a very peculiar way of practicing social criticism or social philosophy, to use an anachronistic term. And this is maybe one of the strategies they both found to outbound philosophy, to externalize philosophy as such. But in what you were saying, I think there is a twofold problem. On the one hand, we have our understanding of Marx's critique of alienation, and here we have a point of heresy or a bifurcation between two different readings of the concept of alienation. An essentialistic reading of alienation. To Marx, the worker would be alienated from their very human essence, the Gattungswesen. Or we can have a proto-Foucauldian reading of alienation, according to which alienation would be the result of a specific production of this human essence. Work as the core of human essence, which can be alienated, is not something given from the eternity, but it is the specific political result of historical determined technologies of power, which is a different way of reading Marx's concept of alienation. And the second problem is whether Foucault has a theory of revolution, whether this subjectification, this autonomous subjectification, this infinite differentiation from the social norms can concentrate at one point in the history to overturn the course of history. And this is the problem that Foucault faced in Iran. And in Iran, he kind of, for a very temporary phase, very short moment in his work, he kind of got rid of this immanence and tried to find transcendence within this immanence. This is why at that moment he's quoting Ali Shariati, who was an Iranian philosopher and theologist. Who was trying to think theology of liberation. In Iran, he quotes Bloch of the Spirit of Utopia. He's using, different Marxist theological thought.
I mean, it's I suppose the problem sometimes is particular passages or particular sentences or reading or interpreting particular sentences, because I think the question that you were raising just a minute ago, in which kind of labor becomes human essence, right? And then Foucault's rejection of that idea of human essence. I mean, there are passages in Marx, there are sentences in Marx that do strike of human essence, of species being, right? That feel sometimes as if they're not historicized in the way in which what Foucault does is to historicize them, right? And he specifically historicizes the labor as our essence, right? And when you do that work, then it's possible to see how alienation can in fact work within a kind of historicized context in which all of a sudden, yes, we become alienated with this essence that has been created for us. It's a socially constructed essence of our labor that we then feel alienated from, and that then causes the conflict. In which case, then we can read Foucault and Marx together perfectly with the Foucauldian emphasis on subjectification and the Marxian emphasis on modes of production, right? And so that's I think that is the most productive way to be working with these texts, right? I don't think that, I think you agree here, I don't think that it's always important to create, it's important not to elide differences, and conflict is important for can be productive. And so I think it's important to recognize those conflicts, but the question is how to read them together in order to create a richer understanding for us today, Now, on the question of revolution, so on the question of praxis, there's no doubt that Foucault had a certain allergy to the term and the concept of revolution. In part, I think it was an allergy to the modern conception of revolution, the conception of revolution as understood through the French Revolution, the American Revolution, a kind of a total transformation of a political revolution, but also a social transformation. He was certainly not allergic. On the contrary, what motivated him was a sense of desubjectification, of changing who we are in our subjectivity. I think that's always, to me, that is the guiding impulse of all of his work. And of course, the concept of desubjectification is not that far from a concept of revolutionary change. It is a revolutionary upheaval in terms of the way one understands oneself, right?
I guess there is this idea of desubjectivation or alternative, autonomous, free subjectivation, to quote different passages. And at the same time, for a specific moment, Foucault is trying to develop an alternative concept to the one of revolution. In this famous piece published in Le Monde, inutile de se soulever,
right.
Useless to produce an uprising, useless
right.
to... He's contrasting the concept of soulèvement, uprising, to the one of revolution. In his terms, the concept of uprising, soulèvement, is older and kind of subterranean. It traverses the epoch of revolution and comes back today. Revolution would have been a specific historical phase which would have captured the energy of uprising into a dialectical machine. This is at least the schema he's proposing in this text. I do think that this notion of uprising, which is also an ambiguous notion, in Spanish it is levantamiento, and the most famous levantamiento was the Franquist counter-insurgency operation against the Republicans and the Socialists during the Spanish Civil War. So Enzo Traverso shed light on this profound ambiguity of the notion of uprising. And it's nevertheless, it is at the center of our present.
Right, and particularly today, right, with January 6th, which was an uprising.
Or the revolt after the George Floyd homicide in the US, or the Yellow Vests movement in France, which cannot be framed as a traditional social movement, but should maybe be think as a soulèvement, as an uprising, as a popular uprising. I think here we got closer and closer to our present, and we go back to this idea that Foucault, as Marx, by the way, was an untimely, intempestive thinker.
Yes. Yeah. But that's particularly helpful, I think, in helping us to try and think about bridging the praxis side of Foucault and Marx. Of course, for both, there's a historical dimension to their own praxis and to their own understanding of what was necessary at particular times. And it changes, I think. It changes for Marx. I mean, you can hear it shifting. You can hear it with the late Marx shifting. Certainly for Engels as well. But for Foucault as well, throughout his life, different relations to uprising, different relations to what must be done. I think the most interesting work for us to do is precisely the work you're doing, which is to find the ways to use each one to enrich us in our thinking about the present.
To resume this movement we're describing, I would say that the line is the one that goes from adversity to heresy.
Mm-hmm.
That's maybe a way to think this double movement from Marx to Foucault, from Marxian traces within Foucault's work, which means where Foucault both presupposed and transformed Marx concepts to Foucauldian anticipations, prefigurations, epiphanias in Marx's works, which means where Marx was kind of hesitating about an hypothesis, for instance, the primacy of the economic infrastructure over other relations of powers and domination. So this is, I think, a way to open up the boîte à outils of the two authors, of the two thinkers, without presupposing a unified system of principles which cannot be violated whatsoever, which is the very classic Marxist and Foucauldian way of studying their own sources, and trying to make move this system of principles and see which variations, which breaks, which discontinuities could be
productive.
Could be make productive.
Yeah. Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Matteo.
Thank you, Bernard,
for this brilliant conversation. And I think our next session will be on the late Marx, actually, with Kohei Saito.
Great.
So, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Let me turn this off.
Sorry for my English, Bernard.
No, it's great.
I